Hi, welcome to Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode, I'm going to be speaking to Dr. Simon Thornley. Dr. Simon Thornley is a public health physician, lecturer, and researcher in the area of epidemiology and biostatistics. His research interests include epidemiological methods, low carbohydrate and low sugar approaches to diet, and the link between scabies and important diseases of childhood, such as acute rheumatic fever. Simon is the spokesperson for COVID Plan B, a multidisciplinary group of academics who have argued for a moderate, no lockdown response to COVID-19. So without any further ado, let's have this important conversation about COVID-19 and the public policy response with Dr. Simon Thornley. Dr. Simon Thornley, thank you so much for being with us here to have this conversation. In a sentence or two, can you sum up what COVID Plan B is and what your position on COVID is as a group?
Well, we have taken a position which is against lockdowns. That's the main issue. We think that the government has gone too hard against COVID, which has been basically a global strategy that many countries have bought into. We support the Great Barrington Declaration, which has been about focused protection for people who are most at risk from COVID. And those are people over the age of 65, people with comorbidities. And so we believe that taking an approach of protecting these people is likely to improve society's health in a much better way than shutting down the whole society and doing lockdowns such as we've seen in this country.
So just to clarify, because I know you've copped a lot of criticism and lots of, speculation about what you do and don't stand for in the public square, you're not proposing conspiracy theories, if I understand things correctly at all. You just simply believe there are better and more effective ways to tackle COVID than lockdowns.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I certainly believe that COVID is a real thing, that the virus is there. There's many difficulties that I've talked about in the Plan B website in terms of definitions of COVID death, in terms of application of the PCR test, but it's not to state that I don't believe that COVID's a real entity and is really causing some problems.
So what does a no lockdown response look like then? What do you think can be done to avoid the spectre of what now seems to be ongoing lockdowns in New Zealand?
Well, I think we need to look at countries that haven't locked down. There's a couple of examples around the world. For example, Iceland, for example, Sweden, for example, Taiwan. So other countries have been able to do to go along with a strategy along the lines of what we suggested. So it has been enacted, but the global, the media coverage that we've had in New Zealand has suggested that the countries that go down this path, it's disastrous. However, as we've seen with Sweden now, their overall mortality for the year is unremarkable compared to previous years. So I believe that countries that have followed such a strategy have actually done pretty well.
I want to talk about Sweden in particular in a moment, but this is one of the things too, isn't it? That there are different countries who have taken different approaches. It's not all one or the other. So it's not let it run rampant or lock down. There's a multitude of different strategies, aren't there, that aren't necessarily all lockdown.
Yes, I mean, for example, let's look at the United States. Um, the United States had several states that didn't lock down, and most of the states did. So even within countries, there's different strategies, and certainly different varieties of lockdown. For example, in Australia, it was clear early on that much more of their economy was working. For example, the construction sector was able to work during their first lockdown, whereas ours wasn't. Calls that I got from various politicians in Australia was saying, 50% of their economy was working compared to uh, 10, 20% of ours.
What are your thoughts on the current approach that New Zealand has adopted? Because it seems to me a lot of people would say, look, Simon, okay, sure, but we kept COVID at bay. It's worked, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I think there's certainly from the outside, the strategy looks successful. We've had several months of zero community cases of transmission, but I think we've got to look at a sustainable approach for what's going to suit New Zealanders for years. COVID is not going to go away. In New Zealand, in Auckland now, we're facing our lockdown number 4. And this is in response to just a handful of cases. We know that costs $500 million a week to the economy. Surely we can't continue with this kind of strategy. We need to take a more moderate response. As I've been saying from early on, we need to learn how to live with the virus. We still have a very heavily restricted border that is posing problems to various sectors of the economy. The most visible has been the horticultural sector, but even the university where I work is suffering from the lack of international students. Where I've seen cases of separation of families across the border. So, although we've had success, or so-called success, we need to think about how we can sustainably have an approach which matches the threat posed by the virus. I believe that the threat posed by the virus has been totally overstated, and the doomsday models that we were all exposed to early on in New Zealand, talking about 80,000 deaths, for example, they haven't materialized. So we need to start backtracking in terms of these restrictive measures that have been taken by the government, and we know that they're causing harm.
Some people would say in response to that, well, the reason we never saw the doomsday scenario was because we acted and because of our action we've managed to stave that off. If I hear you right, and I'm assuming I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that we could have taken other actions that weren't so extreme and still not had the doomsday scenario. Is that correct?
If you look at the modeling carefully, you'll see that they predicted thousands of deaths, even with very heavily restricted measures. So it wasn't as though it was all going to it was going to be sort of zero cases versus thousands of cases. So even that hasn't materialized. And if you look at the deaths carefully, I've recently written a piece about this, is that many of the people who've died with COVID have been on death's door, many in a dementia unit in Christchurch, for example. Several haven't actually tested positive for the virus. The definition has been difficult to nail down. So it's not clear to me that even without the virus, these who have so-called COVID fatalities, which we're trying to save, would have had improved survival.
How long do you think it will be a disruptive influence? I read an article the other day indicating that even if the best case scenario, they got everyone vaccinated and the vaccines work as hoped, it's 5 to 7 years to get the globe vaccinated. What are your thoughts on how long it'll be a disruptive influence with us?
It's very hard to know. It's interesting what the government is saying that Jacinda Ardern is now saying that she hopes that COVID is going to become like a seasonal virus, like influenza, after vaccines been rolled out. What we know is that respiratory viruses are a moving feast, so they mutate, and so a vaccine that may be effective now down the track is not likely to be as effective. We've seen that with uh, the South African strain, that it's escaped one of the vaccines that they've been using. So using vaccines as a sort of panacea, which made me feel very uncomfortable. This is part of the government strategy, basically, that we're going to lock down until we have a vaccine, and then there's going to be no more virus. It just doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny from my point of view. Eventually, I believe we're going to have to say, look, guys, we've given this a good go, but eventually we're going to have to open up and learn to live with the virus. We've seen hospital fatality rates fall precipitously in many, many countries. And what I believe has happened is that the high fatality was related to the fear and some of the policies that were enacted early in these hospitals. So there was non-invasive ventilation, for example, was banned because it was worried that was going to cause spread of the virus. That there was the intensive care doctors reached for the sort of nuclear option, the mechanical ventilation early, and that led to high fatality rates in many parts of the world that were hit hard. So it's clear that we've learned a lot since January and February 2020 in terms of how to better adapt to the virus, and that in terms of treatment protocols, in terms of how best to avoid fatalities from the virus. And really, to me, the major threat is in rest homes, where half of fatalities globally have occurred, and in hospitals where right from the first few case reports in China, we saw evidence of what we call nosocomial transmission in the trade, which is basically the virus spreading to sick patients in the hospital. And doing good infection control in those in hospitals and rest homes is, I believe, is very important, and it's a sort of central part of the focus protection strategy that we're advocating for.
What do we know about COVID now that we're over 12 months into this pandemic? So we didn't know a lot at the beginning. We've learnt some things along the way. What do you think that we've learnt that might be relevant to current public policy? Are we still making policy decisions based on things that were relevant 12 months ago, or a situation that was relevant 12 months ago, but now we've got more knowledge, so maybe we need to fine-tune the policy?
I think we've learned a whole lot since February last year. It's, we were talking about fatality rates of 3%. That's 3 in 100 people, or 1 in 33. So we now know that the fatality rate is closer to 2 in 1,000, perhaps even less than that, 1 in 1,000. That fatality, the virulence of the virus, how nasty the virus, how fatal the virus is, has been dialed back orders of magnitude. So we need to adjust our policy to reflect that. Some of the most surprising information that I've seen is that we had this story of the virus emerging from a wet market in Wuhan in December 2019, I believe. And what we've actually found in retrospective studies is in Italy, for example, and when they analysed bloods that were taken during a lung cancer screening study, 10% of those people tested positive in September 2019. And so what we can learn from that is that the virus was widespread in that region at that time, and there wasn't a high fatality rate. There wasn't overwhelming of the hospitals. So what that says to me is that much of the disaster that we've seen, which occurred around February, March 2020, was related to the response and this over-fearful response. And some of the mechanisms I've talked about there, but also shutting down the hospitals, clearing out the hospitals, putting old people from the hospital back into rest homes, seeing spread of the virus through those rest homes, and excess mortality result as due to those policies. So I think now, seeing hospital fatality rates come right down, that really dials back the fear and the panic from the virus. Yet I haven't seen those messages communicated in the media or by the government in New Zealand. We're still getting the stories of fear and panic. So yeah, those are the important things that I've learned over the last year or so.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you should say that, because it was something I was talking to my wife about the other day. How even now we've got this new community outbreak, but no one's talking about the fact that there haven't seemed to be any hospitalizations that I've seen so far, let alone people who have got to the fatality stage yet. So even with community transmission, it doesn't seem we're at that same situation that we were all predicting would happen, right?
Yeah, which reinforces the lower, much lower fatality rate that's occurred since the WHO was talking about 3 to 4%. It just simply hasn't happened. We've seen over 1,000 cases, I think, across the border in New Zealand, and very few of them have been sick and need to be hospitalized with positive tests. We know that the tests have a false positive rate, that the PCR test is extremely sensitive, and you may not actually have infectious virus. You may just have viral fragments when you have a positive test. And we know the cycle threshold that's been used for the test has been extremely high.
Can you speak to that for a moment? Because I was talking to a friend about this who's a scientist the other day, and he was saying the same thing. Can you explain in layman's terms what that means? If I understand it correctly, that we've known for a long time, for many decades, in fact, that PCR testing can create this result where you can become confused about what you're actually seeing, whether it's live or whether it's something that people have already, a historical case, if you like, that's still within the system.
Well, I think we've rushed out with the PCR test, and it's been concerning to me that all the emphasis has been on the test rather than what's happening with the patient. Do they have a syndrome that indicates that they've got a disease? When we started calling test positive cases, that was the first indication that things were going off the rails from my point of view. Traditionally in medicine, a case has to have some sort of symptoms. It's not just a test positive. That test has to be interpreted within a clinical context. And so the PCR test is an interesting beast. It's a very, very sensitive piece. I mean, our genetic material, which include, there's viruses and bacteria that also have genetic material. We call that DNA, and it's like sort of walking into a library. It's kind of a language, and the PCR basically is like looking for a chapter in a book of this massive tome, which makes up this material that our body uses to produce all the functional bits of us, what we call the proteins and the structure of our bodies. And so this PCR test looks for 3 different pieces of the virus, and it amplifies those pieces, maybe very, very small amounts in the nasal swab that's been taken, and it exponentially doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles, amplifies that target. And it's been known for many years that if you amplify too high, you can get false positive results that actually you may be getting a target which is not what you're after, or you may be identifying viral fragments rather than a whole replication competent virus is actually infectious and poses a public health risk, which is what really we're interested in. We're not interested in people who are non-infectious that have overcome the infection and no longer can spread the virus.
So I guess the $1 million question is there a known threshold of cycles whereby you go above that and it starts to get really hinky about what the result is? And is New Zealand, are our labs testing above that threshold?
Well, yeah, it's difficult to know exactly. From what I've seen from official information act inquiries, the cycle threshold, the number of doublings, which is done for each test, is about 40, which is generally considered very high. And there's a number of studies now which show that if you don't get a positive test before a cycle threshold of between 30 and 35, then it's very unlikely that your body will be able to grow a virus in a cell culture. So it's very unlikely that you have virus which you're going to spread to other people. So yeah, it's difficult to know how important that change would be if we had been using that threshold from the start. It's estimated that in the States, they would have cut half their COVID cases had they used a lower threshold between 30 and 35.
Let's talk about the Swedish approach. You mentioned it earlier. There's been a lot of talk about this, and I'll take you on my journey with the Swedish model, if you like. I first heard about it and I thought, I wonder if they've got the right approach. I was a little bit uncertain. Then there seemed to be some data that came out as last year advanced that was indicating they were doing pretty well. And then towards the end of the year, we were reading about data suggesting that in actual fact, Sweden was in trouble. And now things have gone silent again, and I haven't heard anything since. So I don't know what to make of Sweden. What is the latest data showing? What is your take on Sweden and what they've done?
The thing with Sweden is it's not that they didn't do anything at all. They did do some social distancing. They did do some, infection control measures around hospitals. If you look at the Google mobility data in Sweden, you'll see that they had about a 30% reduction in mobility in the country. So, and actually they had a spike in mortality. And I've been looking at that, and that coincided with the time that their Google mobility data showed that they were they'd gone down in terms of mobility. And so that was a 1 in 150 year spike of mortality, however, which is alarming. And at the time, there was a whole lot of stories about Sweden's failed. It's, shocking. They should lock down and join the rest of the world. Well, what's happened since then is if you look over a longer period of time and you look at the overall number of deaths that have occurred in 2020, it's really unremarkable compared to previous years. And there's this concept in epidemiology of something called displaced mortality. And basically, the idea is that there's a large number of elderly, frail people who will be sensitive to a flu virus or a respiratory virus, sort of chest virus that's floating around. So there was a number of studies early on that showed that countries' fatalities with or from COVID were related to how severe their recent flu seasons had been. And a study which compared Norway to Sweden really later on in the piece showed that, yes, Sweden had this big spike of mortality, but overall its mortality for the year was comparable to previous years and comparable to Norway. And they had spent half per capita compared to Norway in terms of the researchers were actually from Norway, and they looked at Sweden very, very favorably in that analysis.
I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts on the latest New Zealand lockdown. We're recording this today. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of March. So we're in this new lockdown. I'm looking at it as a layman. I can't make sense of it. I look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks in New Zealand, and I look at things like we had that case a couple of weeks ago. I think it was the Pullman Hotel case, where this person comes out, they travel around Auckland and I believe parts of Taranaki. Auckland goes into level 3, Taranaki stays at level 2. At the moment, the rest of the country, even though there's no COVID anywhere else, we're all in level 2. There hasn't been a COVID case, I think, in the South Island for months. It doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. We were out of lockdown last week. Now we're back in again. It doesn't seem any worse than last week, case-wise, but now we're back in. What are your thoughts on this, what's happened right now?
I don't agree with the government response, but I suppose from their point of view, they've gone for this elimination strategy and they've continued with it. So from their point of view, any case of COVID in the community is a complete disaster. And because you've got the symptoms of COVID are so non-specific. You can have any sort of respiratory symptom, and it may be a feature of COVID. It may be a feature of some other respiratory virus. It's very, very hard to be certain that you've ever completely sorted out COVID. And so that was the fear that I had early on, was that we could never be certain in New Zealand that we've reduced, that we've eliminated the virus. How could we possibly be unless we, simultaneously tested almost everyone in New Zealand, or at least did a population survey to check. And so what my fear was that we would get these increasingly draconian rules to try and achieve this unachievable aim of zero COVID. And, even with the sort of watertight border strategy, it's clear that, that we don't understand all the ways that COVID spreads. COVID is being found in dogs and cats. Are we going to swab dogs and cats as well? It's with all this other information that, the COVID was in Spain and March 2019 in the wastewater, and in Italy in September 2019, and yet there didn't seem to be a problem. So, we've seen the fatality rate dialed back. So I cannot, I just shake my head when I see this increasingly shrill voices around maintaining elimination. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I think, New Zealanders are grappling with the long-term implications of this, the uncertainty of it. One handful of cases and 1.5 million people are locked in their houses. I'm locked in my house right now. um, the rest of the country in level 2. And, it's almost as though all the scientific information that we have, which has dialed back the fear considerably, has just been completely ignored. To me, I'm just shaking my head, I'm afraid.
So, yeah, I was going to ask you about that because it seems to me that the zero COVID has become now a millstone around our neck, and that it seems to me that, and if I'm hearing you correctly, you are proposing that we should be moving more to a COVID suppression strategy. So you have to learn to live with some and try and suppress what you can, and particularly the worst excesses of it. Um, is that possible? Is this just an ideological thing? Is it just that they sold themselves on, look how well we've done, we've got zero COVID? Because it feels to me like the latest lockdown, it just felt like literally like the officials panicked. They saw a new COVID case, they didn't understand, they didn't wait, they just hit the nuclear option straight away.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing really has been a sort of mission creep, which has just gone on and on and on. And, initially I could get behind the idea of protecting the health services and protecting intensive care. What we saw in the first lockdown was that actually doctors in the hospital were never quieter. They were eerily quiet because we'd stopped elective surgery, we'd done all that. And so, the infectious disease model theory suggests that even if you're locked down, you're really just kicking the can down the road, that eventually the virus is going to get going. We're just trying to sort of stop this big peak. There's a sort of idea of flattening the curve. And I thought, that's fine. And then we've seen this sort of mission creep go on and on and on, where it's no longer about protecting health services or protecting the elderly, protecting the frail. It's about zero COVID. It's about holding out for a vaccination. And will we ever get back to normal? And so locking down Auckland for a week for a guy who obviously wasn't that sick because he felt like he could get to the gym. We've kind of lost, to me, we've lost our the need to put these tests into a clinical context and to think of the big picture, to look at, for example, when I looked at the age distribution of people who are dying with COVID in this country, I thought, golly, if this is a deadly virus, then compared to people who died in 2019 in New Zealand, the age distribution of these COVID cases should be much, much younger, as it was, for example, for Spanish flu, with the mean age of death for Spanish flu about 26 years. And for COVID, though, it's exactly the same as our life expectancy, around 82 years. And so that shocked me. And I was like, why are we doing all this when people are dying on average at the same age with COVID as they are without? It just simply doesn't make sense from an epidemiological point of view.
Let's pretend for a moment that you were on board with the government strategy. I contrast us to New South Wales, and I know some more people are starting to do this now. As far as I understand it, New South Wales and Australia, they're obviously a close neighbour. They've never had a statewide lockdown. They've never even had a citywide lockdown of Sydney. They've simply used the restrictions locally in a very surgical way. Now, last year, I remember the government promised us that we were going to move towards this surgical strike type model where you would really hone in where the problem is. But why have we not seen that, do you think? And is Sydney a fair comparison?
And from an infectious disease point of view, Sydney's got more adverse features than we do. We are, Sydney is much more population dense, for example, than our most densely populated areas. And yet they've had a more relaxed approach to their sort of restrictions or their lockdown. I think really, you've seen a sort of continuum here. And if Sydney could do it, I guess if you're taking this sort of super cautious approach where every case of COVID is a disaster, as the government is doing, then perhaps, they're looking at places like Victoria, which have had a few cases and then it's ballooned out to many, 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 many more cases. And they're thinking, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to have this sort of explosion of cases that Victoria had. And so we've got to be super conservative. But to me, it's just taking the paradigm of, we must, when we get like we must lock down. That just doesn't make sense to me. And it's quite clear looking at Sweden now that it's not the appropriate comparison to be looking at. We have other options, and if you look at all the data, we've got to ask ourselves, is this really worth it? In terms of when we look at other areas of health, and we try and decide what's worth spending money on, we usually do a cost-benefit analysis. And all the cost-benefit analyses I've seen for COVID is that we've gone way over budget by a factor of about 100-fold, even more than that in some analyses.
So on Monday, the 1st of March, Heather du Plessis-Allen in the New Zealand Herald wrote an op-ed, and she said this: "Let's stop being grateful for lockdowns. They're not a sign of success. They're a sign that things are getting too hard for the government to handle." Do you think that some of the other systems that could help here, like our track and tracing systems, do you think they're up to scratch? Or do you think that perhaps the PR that we are sold doesn't quite measure up with what's going on in the back office?
Well, for me, I think we've got to take it's really the big picture that is important. That if we keep obsessing about every case, about contact tracing, we've got to see the big picture that for the vast majority of us, COVID is not a big deal. It's actually safer than seasonal influenza. We've got to think about, half of the fatalities worldwide have occurred in rest homes and hospitals. So let's put all the effort into doing really good infection control in those places. I think obsessing over the contact tracing, the quarantine, trying to point out the failures of those things is really driving the government to become even more draconian in its response. And to me, that's really going down the wrong track.
Do you think people are starting to experience lockdown fatigue? I could be wrong, but I get a sense that something has shifted in the public mood in the last week or so. I look at things like the amount of people who just left Auckland when they knew the lockdown was coming. You get that sense that people are starting to say, "Okay, we had enough here."
Yeah, I mean, I'm starting to see signs of that, and I think certainly we notice that support for COVID Plan B increases, and interest in COVID Plan B starts to increase with every lockdown. And uh, I mean, you start to see the consequences, and I think the consequences are the thing that may end this. It's a little bit like Pike River. It was very hard to turn around until they had a disaster. And you're starting to see that, for example, food bank queues and demand in food banks is increasing. I've heard it's doubled or tripled some areas. Unemployment, effects on the horticulture, agriculture economy, effects on universities, seeing the stories of separated families across the borders, seeing the increased coercion uh, around testing and quarantine, the sort of stripping back of what we considered to be fundamental human rights in New Zealand. I think it's starting to ask more questions.
Are vaccines going to be the magic silver bullet? You mentioned them earlier. I know there was a lot of people who were saying, well, we've just got to hold out in New Zealand for another few months, then the vaccine arrives and we're all saved. But if I'm understanding the data correctly, the articles I'm reading, that some of the efficacy was not as promised, even if it is the new variants threw a spanner in the works. What's going on the vaccine front?
Yeah, well, I think we're all surprised how effective the vaccines were touted to be in press releases early on. We haven't seen a lot of data on the long-term efficacy of these vaccines. We certainly also long-term side effects from the vaccines, given that these are a completely new technology, and that we're still in the experimental phase of these vaccines. I mean, obviously, we hope. I'm a big supporter of vaccines in general. But for these ones, what we know with respiratory viruses is that they don't stand still. They're a moving feast. And a vaccine that may be effective today may not be effective tomorrow. And so we don't know what the long-term efficacy of these are. And we've seen already evidence, for example, from South Africa. I think it was the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was shown to be rendered ineffective by the South African variant. So, what this entails is yet to be seen. We also don't know whether these vaccines actually protect against serious, severe COVID, whether they actually prevent deaths or prevent hospitalizations. I mean, I was surprised to see that, the Pfizer vaccine being rolled out, and there was only 5 deaths, I think, in the over 70 age group, which is really astonishing for a medical technology that's being rolled out almost across the world. How effective the vaccine is in this frail elderly age group that traditionally have not had a good response to vaccines, and they're really the group that we want to do targeted protection for, and the vaccines are going to be most effective for them. Well, we hope they will. So to me, there's still many unanswered questions, and in terms of the initial government's plan that we were going, which is still on the Ministry of Health's website, by the way, that we're going to hold out for a vaccine and the vaccine's going to save us. I don't think even Jacinda Ardern believes that anymore.
Just a couple of questions to finish with. One thing I've noticed that I found really concerning, and it seems to have been ongoing now, is what I would call the stifling of scientific debate around this issue. and even the stifling of questions around policy. A lot of people like saying things like, trust the scientists, just listen to the science. Science can tell you about things the way they are, what's going on, based on what they know, but it can't tell you what a policy setting should be. That's a moral equation, it seems to me. But even aside from that, I'm okay with that concept if we can actually have legitimate debate. Now, we're not talking about conspiracy theorists. We're just talking about groups like yours who want to propose alternatives or want to take the data and say, let's look at this. There are other ways to interpret things. But it seems that you've suffered a lot from people who just want to attack you or your group as people and not engage with what you're actually saying and not engage with the science. Has that concerned you, the stifling of scientific discourse around this COVID issue?
Yeah, well, the most surprising thing that I saw early on, which really rang the alarm bells, was not directed at me, but it was actually directed at John Ioannidis, who's probably one of the world's best known epidemiologists, highly cited researcher. And he was starting to question what was going on around COVID, the reliability of the data, just things that I would have thought would be healthy to public policy, particularly far-reaching public policy, such as we've been seeing enacted all around the world. So, when I started seeing his videos disappear from YouTube for no apparent reason, that rang the alarm bells to me. And certainly, the level of argumentum ad hominem, argument directed at an individual, at me, I was questioned, do I have the qualifications to comment on this subject? I found that absolutely astonishing. We were pressured to take the website down, to stop speaking to the media. The media, I believe, in this country has been extremely one-sided. I had conversations with some journalists who were kind of saying, look, well done for putting out an alternative view, but let's come back and have a chat with you after COVID. I think they just felt that the policies in their organizations just couldn't support another view. So that's certainly been concerning to me, because science works in a best when there's open debate. When you can't bring up uncomfortable evidence, that tells me that you're actually going off science. And I think also just the sort of hegemony of some scientists in this. I mean, science, when you look at science, it's a technique, where you make hypotheses, you look at data, you test those hypotheses. So scientists, when they're not doing science, are just people with opinions, and just like the rest of us. So I think we need to draw that distinction, that science is actually something you do in terms of interrogating data, trying to get as close to reality as we can. And certainly, yes, scientists, when they're making these far-reaching policy implications, policies that have implications, that have unintended consequences that they can't possibly model, these really need to be, we need to hear from voices that are, from people who have their skin in the game, and from people in the agriculture industry and the horticulture industry that are going to be affected by this. The poorest people who are going to end up in a food bank, what do they think of another lockdown? People who are going to lose their jobs. It's not just about defeating a virus. We've got to take a broader view from my point of view.
Do you think that happened because of fear? Do you think this is an example of how fear just overwhelmed people? So the media didn't want to report other voices because they were afraid of what would happen. The virus would get out of control. Is that what happened there? Or do you think it was just they were so narrow on only one way of solving the problem?
Yeah, I think it was fair. I mean, I've seen evidence of it. The intensive care doctors are talking about it, and I think I saw the same thing around the swine flu situation. We were terrified that swine flu was going to get in the community, and then we did a sero survey, and we found that a third of New Zealand had the virus, and we hadn't noticed, and the hospitals hadn't been overwhelmed somehow. Intensive care had survived this onslaught of the virus that had gone under the radar. And so, I think this narrative about sort of the scary virus, it was so strong in the early days, the killer out of China. And once you start on that narrative, it's very, very hard to dial back. And I think, particularly for governments and large organizations that have been very, very heavily invested in a certain story, then when counter evidence starts coming out, they don't seem to adjust.
I guess the $1 million question then to wrap it all up is, what would you like to see happen moving forward from here? Or do you think what will happen is that I guess we'll be forced into a situation where we'll have to change tact, change strategy, because the equation will eventually shift against lockdowns. It'll just be too costly, too disruptive, too many other harms will result from them. Do you think that's the likely outcome? Or if not, what can we do to start changing things?
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, it's just what can I do? What can I do? I've just been trying to communicate the data, the science, trying to bring up the information that I believe that helps us get a more realistic assessment of the threat posed by COVID, and that will translate into a more realistic policy and a more sustainable policy for New Zealand. In terms of what is going to happen in the future and where it's going to go, I think it's very hard to know. I think like Pike River, once you've got a lot of investment in a certain direction, it's very hard for a big organization to start walking back from that until you get more and more evidence of harm. For Pike, was a it was a major one-off event, but I think for COVID, it's just going to be death by 1,000 cuts. I think slowly we're realizing that there's consequences to these lockdowns, that small and medium-sized businesses in New Zealand are really feeling it, that that's translating into unemployment, that we've spent all our rainy day money on subsidizing businesses over the lockdowns, and that eventually we won't be able to continue this, that we actually need a tourist economy. We need that back, that New Zealanders want to travel, and that we don't have to fear COVID in the way that we did initially, that there's steps that we can take to reduce fatalities that have already happened in hospitals. That the news is actually good news. That we don't have to live with this fear that we started out with in February 2020. That things have got a whole lot better since then, and we understand a whole lot more about the virus than we do, and that should translate into policy in terms of opening up borders and getting rid of lockdowns. We've seen Sweden do fine with a much more relaxed approach to their society. We don't have to restrict civil liberties in the way that we've restricted them. We don't have to coerce people into testing and vaccinations. So I guess I'm optimistic, but in terms of what the future holds, it's anyone's guess. But those are some thoughts.
On that positive note, what I was going to say, slightly positive, despite the uncertainty. It was great to have you on, Dr. Simon Thornley, and I think one thing we've proved today is that you can have a discussion about COVID without going into sort of conspiratorial extremes, but still hold an alternative view on this and not be irrational about it. And so it's been a real pleasure to have you on, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future